Washington decided to refer the matter to his cabinet and ask for its advice. He said, tell me if I should sign this or not. I want to find out about this. I want to make sure that this is constitutional before I go ahead and sign it. So let me get some advice from you. Tell me what you think I should do. I mean, this is what he's doing. He's going to consult with his cabinet. That's why he has a cabinet, is to get their advice on how to handle important matters. And he got back opinions from, there were 5 members of the cabinet then, he got back opinions from them. But the main ones came from Jefferson, who was his Secretary of State, and Hamilton, who was his Secretary of Treasury. And their opinions reflected the political division in the country. Jefferson, although he was not a member of Congress and not actively involved in this debates, but he consults regularly with Madison, who was a member, and the two of them have sort of been working together to keep the Republican Party as a party and have its policies be decided. And Hamilton also is behind the scenes. He's a member of the cabinet. He's in the executive branch. He's not in the legislative branch. But he's working with friends who are members of Congress, and they are the Federalist Party within Congress, the majority party. Well, Jefferson looked at this and said to Mr. President, "Sir, you should veto this message. It is not constitutional." Why not? Congress issued a charter to the Bank of the United States. That's how it's going to exist. It's going to have a charter from Congress. Does Congress have the power to issue charters? That's the question. That's the key question. How do we know if Congress has the power to issue a charter or not? Well, the answer is obvious. Look at the Constitution. The Constitution has given Congress its power. So look at the power of the Congress as defined in the Constitution. You can find that in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. It's like got 15 subdivisions. Congress can do this. They can impose taxes. They can regulate trade. They can establish a post office. They can issue patents. They can do da-da-da-da. I think it's about 15. I can't remember exactly. And it goes down the list, and this Congress can do this, can do da-da-da-da-da. Here's what Congress can do. Those are the powers of Congress. It gets its power from the Constitution. And nothing in the Constitution says anything about issuing a charter or setting up a corporation or setting up a bank or controlling the money supply or any of that. None of that is in the Constitution. So Jefferson says that means Congress cannot do this. We use the term to describe what he's proposing here as strict construction of the Constitution. He argues it should be construed, it should be constructed strictly, literally. If the Constitution does not say something that Congress can do, then it can't. You have to interpret the Constitution literally. You have to take it word for word. If the Constitution says Congress can do something, if it says so in so many words, fine, it can do it. But if it doesn't say it, Congress can't do it. And it doesn't say anything about a bank or a corporation or a charter or anything like that, so Congress cannot issue this charter. So the bill is unconstitutional, and President Washington should veto it. So that's his position. And I want you to see the broader implication of what he's saying here. He's saying that what we should do is leave the whole subject of money and paper and banks and all that, leave it up to the states. It's the states that have the control of that sort of thing. Congress can only rule in certain areas. There are only certain limited things that Congress can do. Everything else is left up to state legislatures. That's the way the United States is. And the broader implication of what he's saying is that the United States is a federation of states. And I've been talking about this debate for a couple of weeks now. We still haven't decided whether we're going to be a federation of states or a single nation. We hadn't decided that in 1791, when this bill is being passed by Congress and coming to the president. We haven't decided it today. What Jefferson is saying is that we should be a federation of states. So sometimes we call his position states' rights. It's states that control those things. And this is in keeping with his whole general feeling about limited government. The federal government was created by the states at the convention. It was the states that sent delegates to Philadelphia. And it was ratified by states. Each state had a ratifying convention. The Constitution is the work of states. States gave Congress power to do certain things. They said, we don't want to deal with this anymore. We don't want to deal with that. We want Congress to deal with it. But Congress can only deal with the things, with the power that the states gave it. Everything else is up to the states. And banking is one of the things that's still up to the states. But this is whole part of his whole feeling about the need to keep a Republican government close to the people. Now you may remember, a couple weeks ago I talked about the importance of a decision that Jefferson sort of pushed through his state legislature back in 1781. He convinced his state to give up their claim to the land in the West because he didn't want Virginia to become a very large state. He thinks that we want to be a republic, and republics only work in small states, or relatively small states. And that means that as far as the United States is concerned, we want power to be hands of the individual states, not the federal government, not a big government. Big governments don't work well as a republic. And so we should not have a lot of power in the hands of the federal government. Federal government is only for certain limited purposes, and the purposes are clearly spelled out in the Constitution, and anything else has to be done by the states. So he urges President Washington to veto the measure as part of his whole idea of limited federal government, strong states, states' rights, strict construction of the Constitution. This is Jefferson and the Republican Party's position and their reason for opposing Hamilton's plan. So now Hamilton looks at this, and he wrote an opinion to the president, obviously encouraging him to sign the bill. I mean, the bill was his idea, so naturally he urged President Washington to approve it. And he said, look, there's a lot of things that are not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. There are a lot of things that are implied by the Constitution. So if you want to sort of line these things up, Jefferson and the Republicans are advocating strict construction. Hamilton and the Federalists are advocating implied powers. There's a lot of stuff that's implied in the Constitution. I mean, just as an example, just to get close to home. The Constitution says Congress can borrow money. Okay, Congress can borrow money. That's clearly one of the things that's right there. That's definitely in black and white. That's definitely one of the things that Congress can do under strict construction. It can borrow money. Well, where is it going to borrow the money? It's going to have to borrow money from banks. That implies that there are going to be banks. I mean, how could you borrow money if there's no banks? So you have to have banks. So the Constitution implies that banks are a necessity so that Congress can have a place to borrow money. Congress can also tax. What's it going to do with the money? It's going to put it in its bank account. That means it's got to have a bank account. There's got to be a bank. So it's implied that Congress can set up banks. There's all kinds of things that are not stated explicitly, but are implied. And the Constitution does say, in the last item of that Article 1, Section 8, the last thing there says, Congress can do all things that are necessary and proper to carry out the above. So it can do things that are necessary and proper. Well, that sort of says Congress can do a lot of things. Congress has a lot of power. It can do many things. It can do things that it needs to do to accomplish its other things. And so this is giving, what Jefferson wants, is giving Congress a lot of power. It's giving it a lot of flexibility in what it does. And this is what he really wants. He wants a strong federal government. He wants a strong national government. If he'd had his way at the convention, there only would be a national government. But it's not possible to talk about that. That's done. He lost that debate back in Philadelphia, so okay, forget about it. But he still would like to have a very strong national government. So as opposed to states' rights, Hamilton is an advocate of nationalism. He wants a strong national government, and that means he wants Congress to have a lot of flexibility as to what it does about issues that come before it. It should have a lot of power, implied powers granted to it by the Constitution by implication. It doesn't have to say it, it's implied. So I want you to understand this whole debate here between Republicans and Jefferson advocating for states' rights, for the idea that the United States is a federation of states, and on the other hand, Hamilton and the Federalists are advocates of a strong federal government, the idea that the United States is a single country, and we have one government for the country, that the states are subordinate to the national government. And that idea was still there. Hamilton is saying one thing, Jefferson is saying another. Okay, Washington decided to go with Hamilton. He signed the bill. Sometimes Washington is identified by historians as nonpartisan. He wanted himself to be above politics. He disliked politics. He was elected and then re-elected unanimously. That's what he wants, is national unity. He doesn't want political divisiveness. He was very unhappy that it had developed in this country. He thought that was a bad thing for the country to have this partisan politics. So he tried to be nonpartisan. So he's often identified as non-political, apolitical. But when push came to shove, he always sided with the Federalists. So he would support Hamilton. And I mean, Washington and Jefferson, of course, are two people from Virginia. They'd been obviously very adequately involved in the war. They'd worked together during the cause of revolution. I mean, they'd been very good friends and worked together and so forth. Relations between them kind of soured a little bit, and Washington became more and more kind of unhappy with Jefferson and the Republicans, and he sort of favors Hamilton. And by the end of his life, he had sort of become, he was really a Federalist, even though he still said that politics are bad. But he blamed the Republicans for the politics, and he said it's Republicans who divided this country, and that's why I don't like them. So that did conclude then Hamilton's plans. Congress approved the bank, and President Washington signed it. So the bank went into effect, and it started working, and it worked very well. It was a very successful operation of the federal government under Hamilton. Now, I left off last time with an issue that just sort of I brought up just to fill the last couple of minutes of the time. But there's an issue that we have to deal with. I want to get it in now before I go on. And this was the so-called Alien and Sedition Acts. And those are laws that were passed by the Federalists. The Federalists still had a majority in Congress in 1798. And they passed those bills ostensibly to prepare the country for the possibility of war with France. This is while the XYZ affair is going on. There's a lot of animosity between us and France, and it looks like there might be war. And so the Federalists said, well, let's prepare for war by passing this Alien Sedition Act. But so it made it illegal to contradict the president or anything like that. Well, who were they after? They were after the Republicans. They were trying to shut down Republican newspapers that were critical of the president. Fake news. But they were also clearly unconstitutional. So the Republicans, Jefferson and Madison in 1798 now, are confronted with the question of what are we going to do about these Alien and Sedition Acts, which are obvious violations of freedom of speech. Well, today we would have an answer to that. And the answer is, you go to the judicial branch. You take the court, you go to take the issue to court, you go through the process, you get the Supreme Court to rule that they're unconstitutional because they violate the First Amendment. But remember I told you that the Supreme Court was still a little bit unclear as to its function. The whole idea of the Supreme Court was sort of a new concept for America. We'd always had courts, but we never had the idea of a Supreme Court. We knew about the executive and legislative branches from England. We'd had that for hundreds of years. We had that in all of our state constitutions. And we had courts. We'd always had courts. But courts aren't part of the system. Madison made it the system with the Supreme Court and the judicial branch. And one of the things that's clear there is that the Supreme Court could declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. Well, if there was ever an unconstitutional act of Congress, it's the Alien and Sedition Acts. But that idea just hasn't quite caught on yet. People didn't know about it. And we'll get to, soon enough, we're going to find out when that idea finally got accepted and we finally started realizing what the Supreme Court was going to do, what its role was. But we haven't figured that out in 1798 when the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed. Instead, Jefferson and Madison went to two state legislatures. Madison went to their home state, Virginia, and Jefferson went to the state next door, one of the new states that's just been added since we became independent, Kentucky. But, you know, Kentucky was just sort of an extension of Virginia. If you look at a map, it's just sort of west of Virginia. And a lot of people in the new state legislature are longtime friends of Jefferson. You know, they grown up in Virginia and just moved to next door to Kentucky. So Jefferson knows those people, and they worked with him. Madison and Jefferson drafted resolutions called the Virginia Resolution for Virginia, written by Madison, the Kentucky Resolutions written for Kentucky by Jefferson, and they declared the Alien and Sedition Acts unconstitutional. And what they said was, a state legislature has the right, the power, to declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. Now this is a strong statement of what I told you was Jefferson's position, states' rights. States are supreme. States created the Constitution, states created Congress, they gave Congress its power, they know what the powers are, and Congress does not have the power to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts. So it's state legislatures that's their job to declare an act of Congress unconstitutional, and that's what happened. And that's the same expression of states' rights, which is still part of our whole status.